to a fungal disease called Panama disease. This fungus cannot be killed with fungicides. It is spreading rapidly across the world. Scientists and breeders are working hard to try to produce new varieties of banana to replace Cavendish. They need to find ways of introducing new genes into the banana plants, so that some of them will have natural resistance to the fungus. Discussion questions. 1. Could breeding varieties of bananas that are naturally resistant to the fungus have benefits other than increasing yields? 2. Is it a good thing that so many of the bananas grown and sold are the same variety? Why do you think this has happened? Should we try to avoid this situation in the future? 14.1 Asexual and Sexual Reproduction. Reproduction is one of the characteristics of all living things. Each kind of organism has its own particular method of reproducing, but all of these methods fit into one of two categories, asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. In reproduction, each new organism obtains a set of chromosomes from its parent or parents. Chromosomes are long threads of DNA found in the nucleus of a cell, and they contain sets of instructions known as genes. As you will find out in Chapter 17, these genes vary slightly from one another in different individuals. Asexual reproduction involves just one parent. Some of the parent cells divide to produce new cells that contain exactly the same genes as the parent cell, and so they are said to be genetically identical. They grow into new organisms, which are all genetically identical to each other and to their single parent. An example of asexual reproduction. Many plants are able to reproduce asexually, and gardeners and farmers make use of this. Asexual reproduction can quickly and efficiently produce many new plants, all genetically identical to one another. This is advantageous to the grower if the original plant has exactly the characteristics that are wanted, such as large and attractive flowers, or good flavor, or high yield. Potatoes, for example, reproduce using stem tubers. When it is warm enough, some of the plant's stems grow normally and produce leaves above ground, which photosynthesize. Other stems grow under the soil. Swellings called tubers form on them. Sucrose is transported from the leaves into these underground stem tubers, where it is converted into starch and stored. The tubers grow larger and larger. Each plant can produce many stem tubers. Figure 14.2. Asexual reproduction in potatoes. The tubers are harvested, to be used as food. Some of them, however, are saved to produce next year's crop. These tubers are planted underground, where they grow shoots and roots to form a new plant. Because each potato plant produces many tubers, one plant can give rise to many new ones. To get even more plants, each tuber can be cut into several pieces. As long as each piece has a bud on it, it can grow into a complete new plant. Plants are not the only organisms that can reproduce asexually. Bacteria, for example, reproduce asexually when one cell splits into two cells. Even some simple animals can reproduce asexually. A tiny animal called hydra, which lives in fresh water and is related to sea anemones, reproduces asexually by growing buds, which develop into a young hydra before breaking away from the parent. Figure 14.3. The bud on this hydra is almost ready to break away and start an independent life. Sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, the parent organism produces sex cells called gametes. Eggs and sperm are examples of gametes. Two of these gametes join and their nuclei fuse together. This is called fertilization. The new cell, which is formed by fertilization, is called a zygote. The zygote divides again and again, and eventually grows into a new organism. The zygote contains chromosomes from both its parents. It can have any combination of their genes. Sexual reproduction therefore produces offspring that are genetically different from each other and from their parents. Gametes. Gametes are different from ordinary cells, because they contain only half as many chromosomes as usual. This is so that when two of them fuse together, the zygote they form will have the correct number of chromosomes. Figure 14.4. Chromosome numbers in sexual reproduction. In most organisms that reproduce sexually, there are two types of gamete. Female gametes tend to be relatively large, and they do not move. In plants, the female gamete is a nucleus inside an ovule. In animals, it is called an egg. Male gametes are usually much smaller, and they can move. In plants, the male gamete is found inside the pollen grains. In animals, the male gametes are called sperm. In humans, there are two sets of chromosomes in each cell. One of these sets came from the father, and one from the mother. Each set contains 23 chromosomes, so in total there are 46 chromosomes in each body cell. A cell or a nucleus that has two complete sets of chromosomes is said to be diploid. But human egg and sperm cells only have 23 chromosomes each. They each have a single set of chromosomes. A cell or a nucleus containing a single set of chromosomes is said to be haploid. Gametes are haploid. When an egg and sperm fuse together at fertilization, the zygote which is formed will therefore have 46 chromosomes, the normal number. Zygotes are diploid. It is important to realize that not all organisms have 46 chromosomes. For example, the cells of a eucalyptus tree have 22 chromosomes. Their male and female gametes each have 11 chromosomes. When these gametes fuse together, they produce a zygote that has 22 chromosomes. Gametes are made when cells in reproductive organs divide. For example, human sperm are made when cells in a testis divide. The gametes inside pollen grains are made when cells in anthers divide. Normally, when cells divide, they do so by a process called mitosis, which produces new cells that contain exactly the same number and type of chromosomes and genes as the parent cell. But gametes must have only half as many chromosomes as their parent cell, so division by mitosis will not do. When gametes are being made, cells divide in a different way, called meiosis. Mitosis and meiosis are both described in Chapter 16. In flowering plants and animals, meiosis only happens when gametes are being made. Meiosis produces haploid gametes from diploid parent cells. Often, one organism can only produce one kind of gamete. Its sex is either male or female, depending on what kind of gamete it makes. All mammals, for example, are either male or female. Sometimes, though, an organism can produce both sorts of gamete. Earthworms and slugs, for example, can produce both eggs and sperm. An organism which produces both male and female gametes is a hermaphrodite. Many flowering plants are also hermaphrodites. Questions. 1. The cells in a durian tree have 28 chromosomes. How many chromosomes will there be in a nucleus in an ovule of a durian tree? 2a. What is the haploid number of a durian tree? b. What is its diploid number? 3. Inches a plant. The root grows when cells divide just behind its tip. Pollen grains are produced when cells divide in its anthers. Explain why cell division by meiosis happens in the anthers, but not in the root. 14.2 Sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Flowers. Many flowering plants can reproduce in more than one way. Often, they can reproduce asexually and also sexually, by means of flowers. The function of a flower is to make gametes, and to ensure that fertilization will take place. Figure 14.6 illustrates the structure of an insect-pollinated flower. Figure 14.5 shows flowers of Eucryphia, which makes both male and female gametes, so it is a hermaphroditic flower. Most, but not all, flowers are hermaphrodites. Figure 14.5, flowers on a South American tree called Eucryphia. Can you identify the different parts of the flower? Figure 14.6, The structure of a simple flower. On the outside of the flower are the sepals. The sepals protect the flower while it is a bud. Sepals are normally green. Just inside the sepals are the petals. These are often brightly colored. The petals attract insects to the flower. The petals of some flowers have lines running from top to bottom. These lines are called guide lines because they guide insects to the base of the petal. Here, there is a gland called a nectary. The nectary is a gland at the base of a petal that secretes a sugary liquid called nectar, which attracts insects. Inside the petals are the stamens. These are the male parts of the flower. Each stamen is made up of a long filament, with an anther at the top. The anthers contain pollen grains, which contain the male gametes. The female part of the flower is in the center. It consists of one or more carpels. A carpel contains an ovary. Inside the ovary are many ovules, which contain the female gametes. At the top of the ovary is the style, with a stigma at the tip. The function of the stigma is to catch pollen grains. The female parts of different kinds of flower vary. One of the differences is the arrangement of the ovules in the ovary. Figure 14.7 shows one arrangement. Figure 14.7, section through the female part of a flower. Pollen grains and ovules. The male gametes are inside the pollen grains, which are made in the anthers. Figure 14.8 illustrates a young anther, as it looks before the flower bud opens. You can see in figure 14.8b that the anther has 4 spaces inside it, which are called pollen sacs. Some of the cells around the edge of the pollen sacs divide to make pollen grains. When the flower bud opens, the anthers split open. Now the pollen is on the outside of the anther. Figure 14.8, how pollen is made. Pollen looks like a fine powder. It is often yellow. Under the microscope, you can see the shape of individual grains. Pollen grains from different kinds of flower have different shapes, sometimes spiky, sometimes smooth. Each grain is surrounded by a hard coat, so that it can survive in difficult conditions if necessary. The coat protects the male gametes that are inside the grains, as the pollen is carried from one flower to another. Figure 14.9, pollen grains on the surface of an anther of a hibiscus flower. This is a scanning electron micrograph, and the colors are artificial. The pollen is not really purple. The female gametes are inside the ovules, in the ovary. Each ovule contains a nucleus. Fertilization happens when a pollen grain nucleus fuses with an ovule nucleus. Figure 14.10, a section through the ovary of a daffodil flower. The green part is the wall of the ovary, and you can see part of the short style at the top left. Each little white structure is an ovule, and each ovule contains a nucleus that is a female gamete. Pollination. For fertilization to take place, the male gametes must travel to the female gametes. The first stage of this journey is for pollen to be taken from the anther where it was made, to a stigma. This is called pollination. Pollination is often carried out by insects. Insects such as honeybees come to flowers, attracted by their color and strong sweet scent. The bee follows the guidelines to the nectaries, brushing past the anthers as it goes. Some of the pollen sticks to its body. The bee then goes to another flower, looking for more nectar. Some of the pollen it picked up at the first flower sticks onto the stigma of the second flower when the bee brushes past it. The stigma is sticky, and many pollen grains get stuck on it. If the second flower is from the same species of plant as the first, pollination has taken place. Figure 14.11, the bee has come to the flower to collect nectar. Pollen gets stuck to its body, and the bee will then carry this to the next flower it visits. Activity 14.1. Investigating the structure of a flower. Work with a partner for this activity. You will need a flower, and perhaps also some transparent sticky tape. Look carefully at a simple flower, one that has a ring of petals, surrounding some anthers and ovaries. Using figure 14.5, identify each part of the flower. Now take off the outer ring of flower parts, the sepals. You can stick them into your book if you like. Even better, you could construct a table with 3 columns. Name the part in the first column, stick the part into the next one, and write a description of its function in the third column. Work your way through to the center of the flower, removing each ring of flower parts in turn. Reflection. Do you find that doing something active, such as taking apart a real flower, helps you to understand it better than just looking at a flower or a picture of one? If you do, think about how you could use some kind of activity to try to help your brain to understand and remember other topics. Wind pollination. In some plants, it is the wind which carries the pollen between flowers. Figure 14.12 shows a grass flower, which is an example of a wind-pollinated flower. Figure 14.13 shows pollen grains from a grass flower. You can see how smooth they are, compared with the spiky pollen grains in figure 14.9. Figure 14.12. A grass flower, an example of a wind-pollinated flower. Figure 14.13. Pollen grains from a grass flower. These small, smooth grains are adapted to be carried easily by the wind. Wind pollen